by the way, we can't see anything, so you could be doing whatever you want up there. So yeah, no, absolutely fantastic film, Orla, and really enjoyed everybody's experiences. And as you say, it was kind of a really positive. You know, obviously those stories have to be shared, where you know through the AIDS pandemic and all of that. But great to see the kind of positivity. David, do you want to come and join us? Sorry. You're okay. So yeah, I'm very quickly going to just introduce by name each of our panelists, but let them kind of introduce themselves and explain kind of a bit of their interest in this evening's conversation. So we have Wellington, we have Orla Egan, whom at this stage you know, we have David Carroll and Maurice Devlin. I'm drawing a blank. So maybe Maurice, if you want to start and just introduce yourself a bit.
Okay, we were invited to start by saying why we're here, basically, and what our interest is. So, my name is Maurice Devlin, and I think the main reason I'm here is that I was a DJ in Flikkers. Not quite, and of course Flikkers is a key reason for us being here together tonight. Not quite from the very beginning, but from not long afterwards and up until the sad end, the fiery end. I was the DJ on the night of the last Halloween ball in 1987. I don't think I'm responsible for the fire, but that was a few days later. But I can't remember, to be honest. And another reason for being here is that at the same time, for most of those years, I was on the council of what was then the National Gay Federation, which was based in the Hirschfeld Centre, where Flikkers was the nightclub. And the council was the elected committee of the organisation. And so I was involved therefore in all of what happened, you know, in the building, not just the nightclub, but the political work and the campaigning work, all under the banner gay rights or human rights. And Flikkers was the fundraising arm or activity, the main fundraiser for everything that happened. And for most of the members and probably a lot of the council members of the organisation, that was all it was. It was the fundraiser, and it had no particular interest, certainly no great significance beyond that. Whereas I and some of my friends and colleagues, certainly most of the other DJs, including Tony, I know, would have seen the disco and the dance floor as being just one of the places where we pursued and tried to enact that principle that gay rights are human rights. At the time, I was also a youth officer with the statutory youth service in the VEC in Dublin, and I was a postgraduate social science student, and I've gone on since then to spend my life in teaching and researching in applied social science. But at that time, I was becoming energized and exhilarated through reading sociology and philosophy and feminist work across the disciplines. Energized by the idea that the personal and the political are not separate things, that they are intricately combined and intertwined. And I think Flikkers actually, and other social and dance spaces like the ones we've heard about in Cork, they are good examples of that. So maybe it's something I'd say more about later.
Great, thanks, Maurice. David?
Thank you, Hannah. Well, folks, I suppose I just want to start by congratulating Orla. It was an amazing film, thank you. And also the organisers for inviting us to come along and speak this evening. It's great to see some familiar faces in the audience too. I suppose from my point of view, I think I was invited along to take part in the panel as a PhD student who's looking at, in particular, pop music's role and how queer pop music essentially was in the 1980s. So it's a really luxurious position, I think. My background is kind of more involved in gay activism and community development. So I consider it a real treat to be looking at what's kind of a personal passion of mine, pop music. And I suppose over the last 4 years of studying pop music, and in particular its relationship with queer communities, it's really abundantly obvious the really close correlation and connection that exists between this form of popular culture and queer community development. I think they've actually gone hand in hand. So despite really kind of early kind of dismissive attitude towards pop music's capacity, it's kind of in the 1970s and 80s, as gay rights began to be a burgeoning issue, that pop music began to be taken seriously for the first time. So over the last 4 years, my research has shown me how pop music can kind of assist in identity development on both an individual and a collective level. It's also shown me how pop music kind of helps us navigate the space between the private and the personal. I kind of call that the hairbrush and the mirror effect. You know, we've all done the karaoke, even if it's not public karaoke, we've all done it in front of a mirror at one point to our favourite pop song. Our sense of kind of time and framing of memory is often marked by pop songs. So when I began to investigate this, it became really obvious, in a sense, why pop music is so relevant to queer audiences in particular. And then I suppose, as a passion, it was also a personal passion which reflected my own experience. I grew up as a teenager in Finglas in the 1980s, and it wasn't the most queer place to grow up, as you might imagine. So for me, I had memories of, before I came out onto the scene, my only kind of encounters that were positive in terms of representations of homosexuality came from pop music. In fact, pop music, it not only seems to accept queerness, it seemed to kind of positively celebrate it and promote it in the 1980s in a way that other forms of popular culture, like television and film, weren't so inclusive in their doing at that point. So for me, it's that basis I'm here. As a punter, I have to say, I was 1 year too late for Flikkers. My kind of coming out was to Sides, where Tony was DJing also, and the likes of Martin McCann, and I think was an equally valuable and incredibly vibrant queer space, but that was my own personal introduction and a great motivation for me undertaking the research.
Thanks, David. And Orla?
So thank you. I think I'm here to provide the non-Dublin angle, and I suppose for me it's been really important that when we look at, you know, our queer history in Ireland, that we don't just focus on the capital, that we don't just focus on what's happening in Dublin. And I suppose what I'm trying to show, like partly through the film and through my work with the archive, is the kinds of spaces that kind of existed around the same time as Flikkers. People were talking about number 4 McCurtain Street, which was the gay centre in Cork in the mid-1970s. And I think just the importance of those queer spaces and those spaces to form community and fun and to reach out to others. And I think that very often there's this tendency to kind of look at you know, what it was like before decriminalisation or what it was like before marriage equality, and think that it must have been horrendous to be queer. And it wasn't. It was just so much fun. And you know, I was thinking about it, when I look back at the 1980s, it's like this kaleidoscope of laughing, dancing lesbians. And the venues change. But there's that sense of fun and community permeating through all those images. You know, from the kind of parties in people's like bed sits or apartments, you know, you're sitting in the corner having these intense conversations or dancing on these like horrendous, like geometric patterned carpets, or, you know, and then, you know, the kinds of spaces that were created with the co-op. The back room of Loafers like features really heavily, you know, big gang of lesbians squished into this like small smoke-filled place that was just amazing every single Thursday night that you knew you went to Loafers and you would find lesbians. And then things like the Women's Fun Weekend, where you had the numbers in Cork kind of like explode, with people coming from all over Ireland, people who had emigrated to London coming back to Cork and bringing their friends with them, bringing not just, you know, the kind of the fun of that, but also bringing some of the politics and the discussions around lesbian sex wars in London to Cork, and we're all kind of saying it's a load of bollocks. And I suppose for me, you know, I've been thinking recently about, you know, the similarities between the lesbian sex wars, where people were trying to control the narrative around what was acceptable, you know, sexual engagements for lesbians, and the similarities between that and the ridiculous conversations that some people are trying to have now around, you know, who's a woman and who's acceptable in, you know, lesbian and feminist spaces. And I think one of the things that's really similar about both of them is that in the Irish context, we're going, no, we're not having that, you know, and the real strong affiliation that's coming out with the connections between lesbian and trans comrades. And so I digress a little bit from the 80s, but you know, it's just that sense of all the places that we partied, and you know, the weekends camping in somebody's garden. You know, we have women kind of camping all over the place, having a big party on a Saturday night, lingering through to the Sunday morning. I remember one in particular where, you know, we entertained ourselves literally for hours with a pair of gold stilettos that somebody had worn to the party the night before. You know, and, you know, then moving into the 90s with things like the lesbian fantasy balls, you know, again, providing that space that was so needed in the Irish context. I see people in the audience that I had my very first conversation with ever about what colour knickers we were wearing or not. And so, I don't know, I suppose it's just that sense that we need to not look back thinking that the 80s, the 90s were this kind of really, really difficult time to be gay. That is true. There were definite challenges, but it was also incredible fun. But then I think we also just need to remember that not everybody survived that, and not everybody felt included and welcome. And I think in particular, when I think about that, I'm thinking about members of the travelling community who've always felt, or often felt, excluded, and experiences of racism within the community. So I think there's a lot of issues that we still need to address. But sorry for being done long.
Yeah, that's great.
I got caught into all the parties.
Thanks, Orla. And Wellington.
Hi guys. Well, my side of the story is that I wasn't in Flickr, I couldn't go, I was too young and I wasn't living here, I was in Brazil. So, and my side of the history, the part of the panel, is my international view of everything what's happening in Ireland. Because coming from Brazil, the small town, countryside, we didn't have a proper conversation about the sexuality. No, could be female or male or female. We just grow up and the things was there, and then have to do what it was handed for you. And then growing up, I moved to São Paulo, and then I realized what was going on about my sexuality. I had to understand who was I, what I was meant to be. And then I faced this massive parade of 4 million people marching. 4 million people. And moving forward, I moved to Ireland and came here to, I think the first Pride that I was, it was 2010. And the Pride, it was in Christchurch. And I remember Bunting doing this speech. And I realized that it was the marriage referendum that was about to happen. And then I remember that 1 year earlier, 2 years before that, my first visit to Ireland, when I'm traveling, I like to go to 2 places, cemetery and churches. And yes, I'd like to feel what's the real deal, the places. And I was walk about in ILAC, and in the under the ILAC library has this small chapel. And I said, okay, so let's figure out what is going on. And then I sat down, did my pray like a good Christian Catholic man. And then I saw this flyer, and then I started reading, and I found such a nasty and depressing and oppressive reading, and because they are talking about the gay people, no, and they are not welcoming, they are not supporting. It was extremely the opposite, and it was in a Catholic church, and I think that was part of it. And then I said, okay, so I think I can't be here. And then 1 or 2 years later, I was in the Christchurch, the Pride, and Punch was talking and mentioned about the marriage and equality. I said, what is going on in this country? No, and afterwards has the, everything happens, the equality and all the layer support for people in Ireland, making people equal. And internationally viewing and being part of both communities, Brazilian and Irish community, it's interesting because when I speak to Brazilian people about what is happening politically, they only say that it's about the gay marriage. No, Ireland is about gay people get married. But when I talk to Irish people particularly, not only people part of the LGBT community, but everybody, gay, straight, they mention the word equality. And for me, this is huge, because when I mention to my friends in Brazil, the Pride in Christchurch is small, the Pantis talking about this, and he was, oh, Elton, come on, here is much better. We have 4 million people here marching. So it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. And I found quality in Ireland, you know, and especially when I joined the Dublin Gay Men's Choir, which brought me to, you know, the community in Ireland, the gay community in Ireland, and I felt welcome, and I feel like I'm here, I'm home, and I'm happy. So that's a brief story.
Thanks, Walden.
No problem.
It's actually lovely to hear that, and also talking about, you know, what Orla was saying about the kind of solidarity that Ireland's community, LGBTQ plus community, shows generally. And obviously there are problems, but it's lovely to hear that you felt that, you know, that it wasn't about the quantity, it was about the quality more so. But I wanted to kind of bring it back to talking about, and particularly with the film, and also, you know, we've mentioned Flikkers a few times. And one of the things that strikes me is that virtually all of the spaces, I think all of the spaces that we have mentioned are no longer they're no longer around. So I suppose, you know, with those loss of spaces, and does anybody have kind of an idea of how that's come about, or what's happened that's kind of evolved those spaces? And yeah, put it out to. Maybe it wasn't the best question to start with.
I mean, one of the ones that
It's a
still
great
exists is
question.
the key co-op, but it has changed a lot, you know, so I think most of the time now, and people know the co-op as a whole food shop and a vegetarian cafe. So it's not the same kind of radical hub that it was, but it has seeded a number of other projects. So kind of out of the co-op came the other place, Lesbian and Gay Community Centre in the 90s, and you now have, you know, so there's kind of an evolution, I think, between organisations that you can trace kind of lineages. But I mean, in Cork we lost Loafers in 2015, just after I think Izzy and I won the last Women's Fun Weekend pub quiz. And I miss Loafers. I miss Loafers so much, and having that space that is ours, you know. And I know that, you know, you can go drinking anywhere, but I think it's very different to have a space that's ours. And I think as well, you know, there isn't the same kind of coffee shop that you could have just popped into in the other place. So I think those kinds of community spaces, I feel the loss of those, and I don't know what it would be like growing up without having those spaces.
I suppose, Anna, the most obvious answer is that a lot of community-based and voluntary-led activity gradually got displaced by commercial activity. That's, and that it wasn't entirely due to, but the process, I think the process was already underway. David even touched on that earlier in passing, but the process was certainly fueled then by decriminalization and the kind of increasing acceptability, shall we say, of things that previously had a bit more of an edge to them. But that's not to say that there aren't still some community-based and voluntary-led groups and organizations. In fact, there are some that are absolutely flourishing and that still have a lot of clubs and groups, I mean, you know, sports and arts and music and so on, that still have a lot of the features of the spaces that we're talking about. And it's a good question whether we could, you know, reclaim some of the bigger, more formalized spaces on a community and volunteer-led basis. In principle, why couldn't we? They exist in other spheres of life.
And also, I suppose, I mean, David, you spoke about the music and the you know, pop music in the 80s kind of seemed more queer. And, you know, we're talking a bit about community spaces here. So, you know, with those clubbing spaces, how has that music kind of, does it still have the same relevance?
I think it does, and I suppose, apologies, Hannah, to go back to the next
Oh,
question,
sorry.
I do agree with the points, but I also think, I suppose, it was that really unique context that we had as queers in Ireland, and which was replicated in a lot of Western countries, where the only place where it was permissible to be queer were environments, which were bars and nightclubs. So I think, I suppose, when I'm thinking about where those spaces have gone, I think about that with a reticence, but also with a relief that when I was 16, my option was sides. Now, if I'm 16, I can go to Belong To, or I can go to Outhouse, or, you know, there's places. So I think that's one element. I think in answer to your more recent question, I think absolutely. I think what we've seen in the exhibition that was launched last night and in this discourse is that the personal is the political, and for queer communities, the dance floor was political, and there's no denying that. The kind of resilience that it gave, and also, as I spoke about earlier, that sense of ownership over music, which wasn't even necessarily sometimes designed to be owned. Some of it was designed very particularly for queers, but while other pop music was owned by queers, it was that important place that it created. And actually, recently I was involved in a conference called Queer in the Groove, where the previous GCN columnist and psychotherapist Ray O'Neill presented a really interesting paper on the power of the dance floor in that resilience it provided to queer lives.
And it's interesting as well, bringing the music out of those club spaces, and what Wellington spoke about in finding the Gloria and being part of Gloria, and how that has created a kind of an inclusion for you.
Dublin Gavin Squire.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Apologies.
But yes, as it was great to be part of the choir. I was a member of the group for 4 years, and I learned a lot, not only about music, but how to be part of a community that is like myself, you know, facing the same issues in a certain way, and develop myself as a person, as a man in another country, you know. And because when you change your life in a certain way, that leave your family and, you know, your life back and create something else here, you know, build up a life and go forward. And I found that community, that belonging in Ireland, because back in Brazil, I don't know if the dimension of the culture was too big, or I couldn't understand, but I couldn't see myself as being part of a proper identity, you know. And when I spoke to my friend, for example, I was fascinated about the Pride, you know, because it was small, everybody was there singing "Don't Stop Believing," and and then I mentioned to my friend, who is a journalist, and he said, "Well, it's much better than that. We have 4 million marching here," and then I could see how the conception and the expectation people have, you know, like, because we might have 4 million people, but it's only about the party. And I think Ireland, you know, the life in Ireland for the LGBT community is, you know, is fun, it's great crack. I really enjoy to go out here and dance. I love dancing, who knows me know that. But Ireland has this political vein very strong, you know, it's shown everywhere. You know, and the history is there to show what it is, and the gay history of Ireland is part of this. So,
just what you were saying, Lars, about the commercialization, though, I mean, and you were talking about Pride. One of the things that I find quite disturbing is how commercialized Pride has become, and how exclusive and excluding it has. And, you know, I keep seeing the adverts for the post-Pride parties that cost like 60 or 80 euros, and they're limited number of tickets. And it seems like a huge contrast to the Prides in the past, when everybody would just end up outside the civic offices and everybody was welcome and it cost nothing, and you could be there with your dogs and your kids, and it was much more inclusive and accessible. And I suppose I'd be quite worried about that direction that it seems to be going to, of like being only if you can afford to buy that kind of ticket that you can go and participate in the Pride parties. And of course, Cork has a free post-Pride party, but seriously, the Cork Pride, there are commercial events, but also the end of the Cork Pride parade is still that free party on the parades that's accessible to anybody, and you don't need to have a ticket. So I think, you know, Pride has become much less radical and much less inclusive.
Well, I suppose in defence, Dublin Pride does also have a separate kind of event after the parade that, you know, which is free and inclusive.
Okay,
But
I only have to see
yeah,
that's
no,
free.
yeah. But I suppose, yeah, and one of the things I was going to pick up on in that music, you know, that I suppose, Wellington, where you found your safe space with the choir, and where in a city, you know, in a community of 4 million, that you felt you weren't able to find your space within that. That one of the things for me about the music factor and what we're talking about in the kind of, you know, that it was a way to find ourselves and kind of a queer sense, but that in itself, if you didn't subscribe to that music form and if you didn't like pop, where were those spaces, those alternative spaces for, you know, for people who were into rock or goth or whatever, you know, whatever was there at the time.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I suppose as much as I agree with what Orla is saying about some of the aspects of the commercialization of Pride, I think on the other token, what those club days of the 80s actually bred is what we have now, which is, because I'm 49 years of age, a situation that I don't fully understand, and that's the way it should be with pop music. Actually, it's for young people to change the world. And again, the conference I spoke about recently, Queer the Groove, which is actually available to watch online. If you go to dcu-eros.com, you can watch the presentations. But what struck me more than anything was I was chairing a session, and the session involved 3 young trans presenters, one from Germany, I think one from France, and one from the United States. They were all talking about a form of pop music called hyperpop, which I had never heard of, like never heard of, and have since realised that this genre has actually specifically become known for the amount of trans-specific talent emerging from the genre. I'd never even heard about it. So for me, in a sense, although things have become disconnected in many ways, I think that influence of pop and its ability to channel that political edge of identities that have been marginalised is still really important.
And also, Hannah, Flikkers, and this is probably also true of other dance spaces, but Flikkers was, of course, primarily associated with dance music, with disco music, and so on. But it wasn't only, and there was a very deliberate effort in Flikkers to create spaces for other types of music. Nothing ever took off the way that the dance music did, but it wasn't that it was, you know, there was an effort to be inclusive. But this has come up already. Dance clubs and discos and so on, like everywhere else in society, have their own hierarchies and their own forms of inclusion and exclusion. And, you know, if you were lucky, and I was certainly lucky, then somewhere like Flikkers was experienced as a kind of utopia, to use a word from the theme of the event. You know, I mean, utopia literally means somewhere that doesn't exist at all, no place. Flikkers did exist, but it had a kind of an otherworldly feel to it in the context of its time, especially, and it's no accident that another club set up across the water the same year as Flikkers actually was called Heaven, it still is. So, because dance music, and I suppose all good music, or all, you know, many other artistic pursuits, are about a form of rapture and a form of being transported. And that's certainly something that it's a kind of opportunity that places like Flikkers created for people. And that goes so well with all of the things we've heard about earlier, all of that sense of solidarity and community and tribe. I mean, back then I was studying sociology, but the sociology of tribes had not emerged. The term wasn't used in the way that it is today, but we are talking about something tribal and ritualistic. And that was so important to the burgeoning movement at the time at an individual level, but there were exclusions. And one very obvious one was the way in which, you mentioned the traveller community, Orla, that's absolutely true. The Flikkers and indeed the Hirschfeld Centre was a very gendered space in very complex ways, not in a simplistic way at all, you know. But the one thing I do want to mention about it then on the more campaigning political front that I think is vital to its contribution is that while the music was primarily popular, it wasn't chart-based, but it was primarily popular, or at least it was ahead of the charts. I think that's more accurate. Consistently ahead of the charts, but also strategically so. And it was a conscious, strategic, organizational decision and investment. Investment in high quality music, high quality sound and high quality music systems, and investment in music, buying subscriptions to music that wasn't otherwise available to anybody in Ireland. So that was all about being in the vanguard. It was ensuring that the organisation and the club was in and seemed to be in the vanguard. And why that was so important politically was that it was so counter to the dominant image of queer people in Ireland at the time. And of course the word queer was only used then pejoratively and poisonously. And the image was of people and of lives that were sad and seedy and surreptitious, you know. Whereas this was, Flikkers became anyway, maybe not initially, but it became the hippest, or one of the hippest places to be in the capital city of the country, you know, underneath the central bank. So that, apart from being a personal transportation for us all on the dance floor or near the dance floor, if we happen to love that type of music, as you say, it was also a great political success and a vital part of the change, particularly among younger people, a part of the process of changing attitudes, because it's where young straight people wanted to be.
And what I think is really amazing is, you know, you talk about creating those spaces and that sense of rapture and community and tribe, that we often did it in the grottiest of places, particularly for, you know, the women's discos, you know, and the dance floor in the other place, the toilets literally leaked on the dance floor on a number of occasions, and we just kept dancing. You know, I remember going to call it a club would be a bit of a stretch, a place that happened up over, I think, the Trinity Bar in Dublin at one stage, and it was like up a stairway, and it was this carpet that was so sticky from like beer spilling so much on it that you couldn't really dance because you stuck to the carpet. And I think the best nights of my life were had in that space, you know, and you know, it was kind of like a bit of a shock when somebody started to run a women's club in the top floor of the Opera House in Cork. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful, but it wasn't the same, it wasn't a good deal.
One of the things that kind of strikes me as well is there's a lot of nostalgia around these spaces. And Maurice, you mentioned Utopias, and one of the things we do with nostalgia is that we kind of idealise these spaces. So one of the kind of overarching conversations that Francis is trying to create with the series of events around Flikkers is questioning that idea of where are these spaces for the for the community who are aging, or for, you know, the community who were part of these spaces in the 70s and 80s and are now being kind of not necessarily catered for within the community or within the wider community. So I suppose, to put a question to each of you, what would you perceive to be a utopian space within the current queer community, or LGBTQ+ community? And you don't have to raise your hands, you can take turns. Just jump in. I started on a difficult question and I'm kind of finishing on a difficult question.
Sorry, is it what would it look like, or it could be an example of one that exists?
Well, anything, either or. I mean, you know, it was something that we kind of discussed prior to this conversation, and obviously with the title of the event, you know, Queer Spaces, Queer Utopias. I mean, is there anything that you would feel?
Look, I can mention one, and it's one, not so much even one that I have very extensive, direct personal experience of. It's kind of vicarious in the sense that my late husband, Kieran, was a member when he came to live in Dublin, after we'd been in a relationship for some years with him coming at the weekends but working elsewhere in the country. And when he came to live in Dublin full time, he said, "I'm sick of only knowing your friends. I'm going to have to make some of my own." And he joined the Dublin Front Runners Club.
Oh, yeah.
And then through him, he was a member for some years, many years, up until he died 4 years ago. And through him, then I made friends that are members of the Front Runners Club. I never became a member myself, and that's not going to happen. But, you know, there's something utopian, in one sense of that word, about what I observe in a club like the Front Runners Club, and in the Front Runners Club among that gang, in the sense that they're all there on their own terms. It's entirely voluntary. It's not only, or sometimes even primarily, about the run. It's about people being together and having fun and supporting each other and looking after themselves, you know, doing something that's healthy and fit and all the rest, but having a ball as well. And that's also part of a global movement, you know, and it means that when somebody goes traveling somewhere else, they can check out the Front Runners. That type of thing, I think that could be replicated. And of course it is. I just happen to be personally very familiar with that one through Kieran, but there are similar models in other areas of life and other types of activity. So I think that's absolutely, you know, so vital to being a member of any community, and so vital to our well-being. But apart from that, I think it's really about, you know, if you're lucky enough, having friends and building a friendship group that will stay with you through your life, in which you can still get transported, even if not perhaps on the floor of a big nightclub. You can do it in your own place or somebody else's, you know. You can still have fun of the same type of fun.
Did anybody else have?
I mean, I suppose for me, my utopian one is one that's inclusive and accessible, and you know, that people feel welcome and able to be there. And you know, yeah, we look back with rosy tinted glasses on the previous spaces. But I think for me, in terms of you know, changes in terms of my participation and my ability to engage with the community, it wasn't about getting older. The crucial difference was when I became a parent. And I think, you know, that as much as the LGBT community has fought for marriage equality and campaigns for parental rights, as a community, we're really not inclusive in a practical way of parents and children, and particularly for people who parent on their own or don't have, you know, family support or the funds to pay for babysitting. And that was the thing that made the difference for me in terms of my ability to engage in the community, because most events are organised in pubs and clubs. Community organisations often ban children from coming to community meetings. And then ironically, when my child finally got to the age where I could have been free to go out and about, there's a bloody pandemic. So I think there might be a conspiracy out there, but I think it's something that I think we really need to reflect on, you know, because I know that I was excluded as a parent from a community that I've been very much part of for a long time.
I suppose I don't think we do too badly. I think people have mentioned really obvious and accurate kind of issues, the gendered stuff, which has been ongoing, the inclusion of people from different countries, the barriers to their participation. Certainly for me, my own experience when I worked in the Gay Men's Health Project in the 1990s as an outreach worker, it was during the time of that huge commercial explosion after decriminalisation. So suddenly you went from 300 or 400 brown nightclubs within a space of 3 or 4 years to 20 or 30 choices. For me, the elephant in the room there was class in the 1990s still. The scene was hugely classist. You know, we had venues that didn't allow people in based on the type of sports wear they were turning up in. You know, that wasn't too long ago. But having said all of that, I don't think we're too bad, because I think as queers who are used to that experience of being the other, we're a little bit more adept at looking out for that exclusion. It's not perfect, but I think we call it and we rein it in. Or as example of the trans stuff, it's not happening here, the anti-trans stuff, thankfully. And so we're kind of hopeful.
Wellington, have you?
I think it's important we try to pay more attention on people. People are there, they have their own life, their own history, and some of them, they are not at the same level as we are. And I remember, because you mentioned about pride and commercialization, I totally agree with you. But anyway, one of the year I was in one of the pubs, the gay pubs, and the day after the Pride, and everybody there, all the gays, the same way that we are dressing up and whatever, dancing. And suddenly my friend and another friend, me and a friend from the choir, we are having a chat and have our pints, whatever. And then we look at the counter and we saw those two guys. They stand out from everybody. We could say that they are from the country, somewhere remote, because their clothes, what they're wearing, and they have, one of them has one bag from Dune store, not advertised, but anyway, Dune store, another one was Tesco. And they were in a gay bar having their pints. And everybody dancing. It was the Sunday after Pride. So, and then, because this friend of mine, he was a teacher in Trinity College, and then he said, look at this is so beautiful, it's so amazing. And then we start talking, should we talk to them, should we not, what should we do? No, because anyway, they are trying to find their belonging, who they are. Because if you are two straight guys, obviously they wouldn't have their bags in there. They see all those gays, guys and gay girls kissing each other, they run away. But they were there having their pints, and they wasn't looking anywhere because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know how to behave. So I think it's important we look after each other. The world is so damaged and selfish. So some people there need hello, okay.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we might have a microphone there if anybody has any questions. Where there is. Yeah, we're just getting the microphone there. Sorry, Fran, there's one just over here. Yeah.
I'm trying to find out microphone. I think Orla, that's fantastic. I think you've done a fantastic work there. I'm from Cork myself, and I must say, I think you've definitely tried to create an image of Cork, maybe in Ireland, that wouldn't have been in everyone's reality at the time. And I think the Ireland we have today, I don't think we should be looking back at the 80s as something to celebrate, because for the majority of people, gay was being very niche. It was looks like, and if you take those places like Loafers that you may have liked and others may have liked, they were really hidden. The first gay bar that I went into, or gay club I went into here in Dublin, it was behind a locked door. I mean, that's not good for most people. So I wouldn't, while it's an accurate reality, no doubt, for a small group of people, for most people, I think, the Ireland we have today is far, far, far more inclusive. And thankfully, I think that is the case for all of us.
Yeah, thank you, and I agree with you that the reality was very different for those who could find community than those who couldn't. And I think we do need to have nuanced versions of our history. I mean, I think what I'm trying to tell in this particular one is what happened when people did find community and the difference that made. But some of the stories, like from the 70s, two people like existing exactly the same time that I've interviewed. One is a woman who came out in Cork in the 1970s and could not find community. serious impact on her mental health until she ended up emigrating and finding a lesbian community in London and a very different experience. And that person existing in Cork at the same time as Dave Gordon, who talks about the circuit of fabulous gay parties that were happening simultaneously. So I think you're right that not everybody's experience was the same, but for those who did find community and were part of the community, it was a very positive experience that counterbalanced the kind of narrative in society that we were sick and sinners and criminals. Do you know? So I agree with you, but I think it does it depend on whether you found community or not, and whether you felt included and welcome there. Thank you.
We've another question over here for Lee.
Hi, I'm Pradeep, him. This is exciting and learning discussion, but I differ from lot has been said. As an immigrant person from Asian background, cis gay man, and living in Ireland for 10 years, I think the utopia for people like me is quite like a dream. It is like Alice in Wonderland. If you see the one topic I was expected to listen here and discuss here, the racism, sexual racism and stereotypes. I struggled 10 years to make friends. I still feel spine chill to go alone to dance or go alone to having pint in the panty or George. I don't like that place at all. Or Street 66, and beyond that, I have many Asian lesbian stories of like how it is isolating and not inclusive. About dance, I like one quote made by David that about dance floor, and that's what I found after 8 years, 8 times 365 days. I found grace, and then I found straw berries. And that was such an amazing experience. And I was thinking like, why it took 8 years to find place like strawberries or place like Grace. And also about thing when you come from particular background, like Asian background. Unfortunately, scene is not that inclusive. You have to struggle a lot. You cannot go alone and dance. It is not like, oh, you can go alone, dance, having drink, and then you will talk with people, be friend or hook up or date or kiss or sex. No, it's never happened with Asian people. And then again, I was part of Dublin Front Thunderers. I was there for 4 years. I struggled to have friends, and now I stopped going there because going as only one Indian person in that whole crowd, it is daunting. And I just really struggle in lockdown to have those friendship connections. So for me, all this discussion is more like a fairy tale and glorious. But it took me 8 years to meet people like Tony or Thomas Strong or Stevie. So that is such a long time, and I think community need to introspect. History was always nice and glamorous. There is a lot to learn, but also and to think that Ireland is changing. Post-Trump, post-Brexit, immigration pattern, people coming here for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is critical skill. All these people, those are educated, well-evolved people, and they are looking at Ireland. It's a very progressive country where we have marriage referendum won with this landslide vote. But still, deep down in our personal lives, personal circle, there is utopia is still a dream. It's not even we are talking about the view of utopia, and we need to think about the whole spelling of utopia. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pradeep. And I think that really might be a kind of a nice way to wrap up and speak about, go back to kind of, I think, what really has been the kind of conclusion in that, you know, we as a community, we really need to be more inclusive and to not just to speak about that inclusion, but to actually create that inclusion and be that inclusion. So on that note, I would like to say thank you to the panelists. And we are going to have the screening of Our Love is History. So I'm going to invite Caroline Campbell, the filmmaker, and maybe I think she wanted to invite Izzy Kamikaze and Tony Walsh briefly to introduce the film before we
Hi everyone, and thanks to Bealtaine Festival for having us, and it's lovely to screen this film in front of this audience in particular. It's like a real buzz. I want to say also that this film was made with my collaborator Darren Bulger, who's here tonight as well, so claps to him. Just to give you a quick background, it was made with the young people who were going to Mother. They're younger than me. I still think I'm young, but I'm not. So I'd be in Mother, and you know, you kind of like being there, you'd be whatever, in whatever state you might be in. And for people who don't know, Mother's a nightclub that was going. Is it still going on? It is still going on, right? That was, you know, that went on a Saturday night in Dublin, and it's still going on. But I kind of be in Mother, and you know, whatever state you'd be in, you kind of go, God, everyone's wearing the same clothes as years ago, right? And you'd look around, and people would be in kind of docks and biker jackets, and I kind of that cycle of fashion where things come around, and I kind of wondered about the young people, and I said, like, what experiences? How is it? Like, what do they share? They share the same clothes as 30 years ago, but what do they share of? Like, what's in common, what has changed between the dance floor, people on the dance floor now and the people on the dance floor then? So that's one side. So the kids, the young people would come along randomly, and I never knew who was coming, right? So it was just a real lottery. I'd say, will you just pick someone of your friends and ring them up and see when they come along? And so you didn't know what was going to happen. And that was kind of the beauty of it. You know, it was often like as well, they'd be stuck on a rollover, you know, you wouldn't get them. So it was very much like herding cats, right? Now, also the kind of background to the film is that I was a creature of the rave scene in Dublin, so which would have been sides as well from about 89, 90 afterwards. Winnie Coakley is here also from that particular scene, and I used to feel bad because Tony, of course, was DJing on the scene right in Sides. Sides was the place we went to, and I felt bad in later years that I had been really unpolitical. And it dawned on me what other people had been doing. Like I just thought Tony was not just, you know, saying, obviously he was only a DJ and he didn't do anything else, right? We had Fabulous All Back to Mine, so that was it, and we loved him for it, right? And then I just kind of realised that he'd like made my life possible, him and Izzy, right? I went, oh God, Carly, you dope. And so this film is a tribute to Tony and Izzy for all the work they did and being much braver than I ever was. On another note on that, and a conversation for me and Winnie Coakley subsequently, I was saying, you know, it wasn't very political just to be on the rave scene and just be clubbing and all that. But Winnie said, no, actually, there was a politics in it. To be like a dyke on a predominantly straight scene had a politics. To kiss another woman on a straight scene had a politics, even though, you know, back to the person was the political. So yeah, I guess, anyway, I hope you enjoy the film. I think, oh yeah, what I wanted to do to finish was I wanted to ask Izzy just to say a few words, because this film is very much about intergenerational stories. And as Izzy was, and most of you would know, I guess, that Izzy was a victim of homophobic violence recently. I'd invite Izzy just
Frequently.
yeah, but just to say a few words on kind of the importance of the intergenerational aspect of passing stories. These are stories that aren't, I guess, it's creating our own histories from places like the dance floor space. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Caroline. Great to be here, Caroline and Tony and everybody who's here. That's really good. It's really good just to see people again. I think we're probably all feeling that way, you know, just finding our feet again. I actually would like to just quickly respond to that last conversation about, you know, the utopia and, you know, whether the 80s was better than now, whether now is better than the 80s. I think in Ireland every story comes down to landlord and tenant. Every story, always. And you know, what's changed, like in the 80s, we were living in these shitty little bed sets and stuff, but you could literally wake up in the morning, I did it, you could literally wake up in the morning and say, I don't like this place anymore. And shove all your stuff into 2 plastic bags and walk out the door, and by the time you got to the end of the road, you'd have another place for 15 quid a week. Do you know what I mean? So that, people had a lot of power in that setup, and the city centre version of that, this area, like when I was still in school in the 1970s, I remember coming to the Project Art Centre. That was one of the things that was already here. Nobody called around here Temple Bar yet. Temple Bar was just like a little bit of street, of one little street. But this was here, and the Gallery of Photography, and they were both kind of breeze block, shed-like buildings, and the Hirschfeld Centre was there. And it was, as this gentleman over here said, completely secret. I've written previously about spending 2 years trying to find the gay scene. And it was, when you found it, I wrote about it as like finding the entrance to the secret garden. When you found it, it was totally obvious. And you saw it everywhere. And you saw us everywhere. But it was really hard to find. Everything was in code. So I had been coming to the Project Art Centre, which was right here on this location, and the Hirschfeld Centre was just around the corner. I'd been going to the Gallery of Photography, I'd been going to various places around here. I had been walking past the Hirschfeld Centre for years. It had a pink triangle outside, that was a code. And I don't think anybody in Dublin really knew what the pink triangle meant, anybody outside of the gay scene, until the play Bent happened at the Project Art Centre. Previous incarnation, less glossy version of the Project Art Centre, and was incredibly controversial and stuff. So that was one code. There was a brass plaque outside that said Hirschfeld Centre. That's a reference to Magnus Hirschfeld. It's another Second World War reference. It's also code. You know, until you knew the code, you didn't find anything. Even the pop music, people have referred to the pop music and said the pop music was very gay. It was, but you know, for me, growing up in Carlow in the 1970s, we didn't know these people were gay. We just knew they were fabulous. You know what I mean? We just knew they were amazing, and like when you came out, it was like you spent your first year or two being told, and he's gay, and she's no, that's just so amazing. Yeah, it was like you got given this whole box of treasures. Yeah, so the relationship to space, like you could live in this bedsit, and like I say, you could walk down the road. I did it once. I left a bedsit, I found another one, I put my stuff into 2 plastic bags, and I was living in Sandymount at the time. You could do that, you could live in a bedsit in Sandymount at the time, and I got as far as Sandymount Green, where there was a supermarket called H. Williams, and in H. Williams I met David Norris, whose aunt lived in Sandymount, so he used to visit her a lot, and I had these 2 heavy plastic bags, and I was coughing heavily, and David said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm moving house." He said, "Where's your new house?" I said, "Sandymount Avenue." He said, "Hop in." And David moved me, and yeah, everybody was moving all the time, but we were coming into town. The rest of this area that wasn't the Hirschfeld Centre and the Project Art Centre and so on was basically derelict. They'd all been garment sweatshops, and they were derelict, and they were awaiting a bus station that the funding was never ever going to be there for. And then CIE decided to let them out on caretakers leases, and all this amazing stuff happened, and including the Dublin Women's Centre and things like the Youth Expression Centre, things, I don't know if some people here will remember these things. There were the Dublin Resort Centre, Well-Fed Cafe, all of this stuff happened here. Why did it happen here? Because there were cheap rents, almost non-existent rents. As far as I remember, the Dublin Women's Centre paid an annual £2 a year to CIE for the few years that it existed. And you get this incredible explosion of creativity. And what you need is premises that people can afford.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we haven't got, yeah? But also I think the community can show great ingenuity in finding places to meet. And we had those grotty bars. We had a great time in those grotty bars where your feet stuck to the carpet. We had picnics in Mountjoy Square. We claimed public space a lot at different times over the years. One of the things that was problematic for me as someone who was involved in Dublin Pride from very early on, and I was one of the people that wanted to resist commercialization, and we got a hard time. We were nasty kind of radicals that were opposed to progress because we didn't want the whole thing to just become completely commercial. And when I left Dublin, I was involved in setting up Pride in Sligo, where we thought, okay, this is too small. This will never become commercial. We can do our own thing here. Because the problem was how we funded Dublin Pride in the old days is exactly the same way we later funded Northwest Pride, which was those discos and stuff that you had on your Friday and Saturday night where you got a big crowd of people, paid the expenses for your parade that didn't make any money. And we always made an effort. In my time in Dublin Pride, we tried for it not to be just for the young people and the people who wanted the pop music. We used to have, a Cayley on the Monday night, and we'd have, an Irish language thing on the Tuesday night. We'd have something else. We'd do all these things that didn't generate any money, and something had to pay for them. And what paid for them were the big Friday and Saturday nights. And as soon as we started attracting large crowds, the commercial sector went, we're having that. Right? We're having that, and then suddenly one year you're trying to sell your tickets that are whatever they would have been 10 or 15 quid a pop at the time, and people are going, no, I can get the George for free, and they have a personal appearance by some big disco star, and a drinks promotion. I can get my first 2 or 3 drinks for the money I'd have to hand over at the door. So I suppose I want to say that we need to set up our own spaces, and we need to support them. And I was kind of blacklisted for a lot of years because I spoke about the subject that a lot of people were uncomfortable about, which was the ownership of the Hirschfeld Centre and the relationship between, I think a lot of people volunteered on the understanding that they were doing something that was eventually going to belong to the community. And just the way the history unfolded, that didn't happen. I know, I'm aware I'm rambling, I'm sorry, just give me one more minute. Another thing that makes me very angry, I came out in 1982, and in 1982 there were already disabled gay activists who were very angry about the Hirschfeld Centre being a building with stairs. Because you could have had your choice in buildings in Dublin at that time, do you know what I mean? And yes, it was necessary for it to be secure, but it wasn't necessary for everything to be up the stairs. And we've had a series of community centres with stairs ever since then, and that conversation still isn't mainstream somehow, that everybody needs to be able to get in. So I suppose, we are in a time when LGBT rights are under attack, and when people are trying to split us and divide us from each other, and I'm thankful, like others have said, that we're not really falling into that here yet, and I hope we never do. But we really need to create our own resources, not leave so much of our money on the commercial scene or wherever we're leaving it. We need to put some of it, we need to put some of whatever we've got, whether it be money or time or whatever, into creating our own resources and maintaining our own resources. And, you know, I'm 40 years waiting for that to happen, and I still hope to, I came out 40 years ago this year. I keep saying that because it just seems so preposterous, you know? But I'd like to see that happening now. I'd like to think that's where we're going. Caroline made this lovely little film. I completely can't remember what we said, but what she did was she spoke to me and Tony, because she was working with these young people who were like 30 years younger than us, and she spoke to me and Tony about our youth, and then basically the film is this younger generation of who are the same age we were in the anecdotes that we're relating, responding. Sometimes they can relate to our stuff, sometimes it's just completely over their head. But it's really nice, and it's very much about location and place, and you'll see in this as well. Some of the places were kind of ours, in a sense. Other places, we made them ours. So I'd just like to see us doing that a lot more. That's all I